The small bell above Pete's diner chimed softly as James Mitchell woke through the door at exactly 6:30 p.m. It was a Thursday evening, and like clockwork, the 45-year-old retired Marine Corps veteran was right on time for his weekly dinner ritual. The familiar smell of coffee and fresh-baked apple pie filled his nostrils as he made his way to his usual corner booth. Sarah, the young waitress with bright red hair tied in a messy bun, smiled warmly when she saw him. "The usual, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, already pulling out her notepad. James nodded with a gentle smile. He didn't talk much, but his eyes were always kind. Looking around the diner, James observed the usual evening crowd. Old Mr. Peterson sat at the counter, solving his crossword puzzle while sipping black coffee. The Thompson family occupied their regular table by the window, their two young children coloring on their paper placemats. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and ordinary. The soft yellow lights cast a warm glow over the worn red vinyl seats. James liked this corner booth because it gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen door. 20 years in the Marines had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, a habit he couldn't shake even 3 years into civilian life. Sarah returned with his coffee, steam rising from the dark liquid in lazy swirls. "Your meatloaf will be ready in 10 minutes, Mr. Mitchell," she said, placing 2 cream containers and a sugar packet next to his cup. She knew he never used them, but she brought them anyway. It was part of their weekly routine. As James sat quietly, his mind wandered to his time in Afghanistan. 3 tours had left their mark on him, not all of them visible. The diner had become his sanctuary since returning home. Here, the only explosions were the occasional sound of Pete dropping a pan in the kitchen, and the only commands being shouted were food orders during the lunch rush. Pete, the 65-year-old owner of the diner, poked his head out from the kitchen. His white apron was spotted with various food stains, and his gray mustache twitched as he smiled at James. "Made the meatloaf extra special today, James," he called out. James raised his coffee cup in acknowledgement, appreciating how Pete and his staff had accepted him as part of their diner family without pushing him to be more social than he was comfortable being. The evening news played quietly on the small TV mounted in the corner. James half listened to stories about local events while watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks through the diner's large windows. A few cars passed by on Main Street, their headlights starting to come on as dusk approached. Sarah brought his meal, a generous portion of meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, and steamed green beans. The plate was always too full, but Pete insisted on giving James extra portions. "You're too skinny for a veteran," Pete would say, though James was anything but skinny. His athletic build and military posture made him stand out even in civilian clothes. As James cut into his meatloaf, he noticed a group of motorcycles rumbling past the diner. The loud engines made some of the customers look up from their meals, but James kept his focus on his plate. He had learned long ago not to react to loud noises, though his trained ears tracked the sound as it moved down the street. The diner's peaceful atmosphere wrapped around him like a comfortable blanket. The soft clink of silverware, murmured conversations, and the gentle hum of the ceiling fans created a soothing symphony. This was why he came here every Thursday, not just for the food, but for the sense of normalcy it provided. Little did James know that this peaceful Thursday evening was about to become anything but normal. As he took another bite of his meatloaf, the rumbling of motorcycle engines grew louder again, this time stopping right outside Pete's diner. The bell above the door was about to ring with an arrival that would shatter the tranquil evening and force James to confront the very things he came here to forget. The bell above the door chimed aggressively as 5 bulky figures pushed their way into Pete's diner. Their leather vests were covered in patches, and heavy boots thudded against the linoleum floor. The peaceful atmosphere instantly changed as conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft music playing from the old jukebox seemed to fade into silence. James didn't look up from his meal, but his trained senses took in every detail. 5 men, all wearing the colors of the Road Raiders Motorcycle Club. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his neck, stood at the front. Behind him were 4 others, each trying to look more intimidating than the last. Well, what do we have here?" The leader's voice boomed through the diner. "Looks like we found ourselves a nice quiet place to eat, boys." His followers laughed loudly, the sound harsh and unwelcome in the previously peaceful space. The Thompson family quickly gathered their children, paid their bill, and hurried out the door. Old Mr. Peterson gripped his coffee cup tighter, his crossword puzzle forgotten. Sarah stood frozen near the counter, her hand clutching her notepads so tight her knuckles turned white. The bikers spread out, taking over the central table meant for large groups. They dragged chairs across the floor, the screeching sound making several customers wince. The leader sprawled in his chair, boots up on the table, leaving dirty marks on the clean surface that Sarah had just wiped down an hour ago. Pete emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. His usual cheerful expression was replaced with concern as he watched the new arrivals make themselves at home. The old man had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this group was different. They weren't just rude, they were looking for trouble. "Sarah, honey," one of the bikers called out, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Why don't you come over here and take our order?" He elbowed his friend, both of them snickering as the young waitress hesitated. James watched from his corner as Sarah gathered her courage and approached their table. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held her notepad, but she kept her voice steady. "Welcome to Pete's Diner. What can I get for you gentlemen today?" The leader looked her up and down in a way that made Sarah take a small step backward. "What's good here, sweetheart?" he asked, ignoring the menu in front of him. His friends joined in, asking inappropriate questions that had nothing to do with food. Pete started to move forward to help his waitress. One of the bikers stood up, showing his full height. The old owner stopped in his tracks, remembering the heart condition his doctor had warned him about last month. He couldn't afford to get into any confrontations. The atmosphere in the diner grew heavier with each passing moment. The few remaining customers were torn between wanting to help and fearing what these men might do. Some quietly asked for their checks, while others pretended to be deeply focused on their meals. James continued eating his meatloaf, each bite measured and deliberate. But his relaxed posture was deceptive. His military-trained mind was mapping out the positions of everyone in the room, noting potential weapons, chairs, plates, the hot coffee pot, and calculating distances. 20 years of combat experience had taught him to be ready while appearing completely at ease. Sarah managed to take their orders, her professional mask holding despite their crude comments. As she turned to leave, the leader reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Hey, we're not done talking to you yet, princess." The sound of a fork being placed carefully on a plate echoed in the tense silence. In his corner booth, James Mitchell took a slow sip of his coffee. His eyes, previously focused on his meal, now moved to the scene unfolding before him. The peaceful Thursday evening at Pete's Diner was about to become something very different. Sarah's face went pale as the biker's grip tightened around her wrist. The other customers watched in horror, but nobody moved. The leader's dark eyes stared up at her, a cruel smile playing on his lips. His four friends laughed and made whistling sounds, enjoying the young waitress's discomfort. "Please let go," Sarah said quietly, trying to pull her hand away. "I need to put in your orders." Her voice trembled slightly, but she tried to stay professional. The name tag on her uniform shook as she struggled to free herself. "Listen to the lady," Pete called from behind the counter, his voice stronger than he felt. "Let her go, or I'll have to call the police." The old man's hands were shaking as he reached for the phone on the wall. The leader turned his head slowly toward Pete, his eyes narrowing. "Put that phone down, old man," he growled. "Unless you want us to redecorate your nice little diner." One of his friends cracked his knuckles loudly, making the threat clear. James Mitchell watched all of this from his corner booth. His coffee cup was now empty, placed precisely on its saucer. His military training had taught him to assess situations before acting, and he was doing exactly that. He noticed how the leader kept his grip on Sarah's right wrist, leaving her off balance. He saw how the other four bikers were positioned, 2 on each side of their leader, but chairs angled for quick movement. The biker closest to the door was nervous, his fingers drumming constantly on the table. The one by the window was the most aggressive, already half rising from his seat. The 2 others were followers, watching their leader for signals. James had seen this type before, bullies who were brave only in groups. "Maybe we should order some dessert too," the leader said, pulling Sarah closer. "What's sweet around here besides you, honey?" His friends roared with laughter, drowning out Sarah's small gasp of pain. Old Mr. Peterson stood up shakily from his seat at the counter, his face red with anger. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," he shouted, his voice cracking. The bikers turned to look at him, momentarily surprised by the outburst. "Sit down, Grandpa," one of them sneered. "Before you hurt yourself." Mr. Peterson remained standing, but his courage was visibly failing as 5 pairs of hostile eyes focused on him. In his corner, James silently pushed his empty plate aside. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a chess player preparing to make an important move. 20 years in the Marines had taught him when to act and, more importantly, how to act effectively. Sarah tried one more time to free herself. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're hurting me." A tear rolled down her cheek, and that was the final straw. James stood up. The movement was so smooth, so quiet, that at first, nobody noticed. He took off his light jacket and carefully folded it, placing it on his booth seat. The t-shirt he wore underneath revealed arms corded with muscle, arms that had carried wounded comrades across battlefields and handled weapons in 3 war zones. Pete saw him first. The old man's eyes widened, and he slowly lowered the phone. He had never seen James look like this before. Gone was the quiet, peaceful veteran who came in every Thursday. In his place stood a warrior, his posture straight as a rifle, his eyes focused and alert. The bikers were still laughing, unaware of what was happening behind them, but their laughter died quickly when a calm, commanding voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. "Let go of her wrist." James' words were quiet but filled with authority, the kind of authority that came from years of giving orders in life-or-death situations. The leader turned his head, annoyed at being interrupted, but when he saw James standing there, something in the veteran's stance made him pause. For the first time that evening, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the biker's face. Everything in Pete's diner went completely still. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ceiling fans and Sarah's soft, frightened breathing. The peaceful Thursday evening was about to explode into action. The leader of the bikers looked James up and down, still holding Sarah's wrist. A smirk spread across his face as he turned to face the veteran fully. "Well, look what we have here, boys. Looks like someone wants to play hero." James remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. His voice stayed calm and controlled as he spoke again. "I won't repeat myself. Let her go." Each word was clear and measured, like bullets being loaded into a chamber. The other 4 bikers started to stand up, their chairs scraping against the floor. The sound echoed through the silent diner. Pete held his breath behind the counter, while old Mr. Peterson slowly backed away toward the kitchen door. "Who you think you are, old man?" The leader sneered, finally releasing Sarah's wrist with a rough push. The young waitress stumbled backward, rubbing her wrist where angry red marks were already forming. James didn't move as the bikers surrounded him. His eyes tracked their movements with the precision of a combat veteran who had faced far worse odds in far more dangerous places. To him, these 5 men weren't nearly as threatening as the Taliban fighters he'd encountered in Afghan mountain passes. "I think," James said quietly, "that you gentlemen should pay for your drinks and leave." His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his stance subtly shifted. Any trained fighter would have recognized the move. He was positioning himself for combat. The leader laughed, a harsh sound that held no real humor. "Oh yeah? And who's gonna make us? You!" He stepped closer to James, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate the veteran. "There's 5 of us and 1 of you, genius." A slight smile appeared on James's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've had worse odds." His voice carried the weight of experience, of countless battles survived and won. The biker by the window made the first move. He lunged forward, aiming a wild punch at James's head. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the stunned customers watching. James moved like water, flowing around the punch as if he'd seen it coming minutes ago. His right hand caught the biker's wrist, his left hand found the man's elbow, and with a simple twist, the large man went flying over James's hip. He crashed into an empty table, sending plates and silverware clattering to the floor. The diner erupted into chaos. The second biker charged in, swinging a chair. James stepped inside the man's guard, redirected the chair into the third attacker, and used the momentum to send both men stumbling into each other. They fell in a tangled heap of limbs and curses. The 4th biker pulled out a switchblade, its steel blade clicking open in the chaos. Sarah screamed, and Pete reached for the foam again. But before anyone could react, James had already moved. His hand shot out, catching the armed biker's wrist in an iron grip. with precise pressure on specific nerve points, something he'd learned in advanced combat training. He forced the man's fingers to open. The knife clattered harmlessly to the floor. The leader, seeing his friends taken down so easily, reached behind his back, but James was already there, having closed the distance in 2 smooth steps. His right hand caught the leader's arm before it could complete its movement. "Looking for this?" James asked calmly, his left hand holding up a small revolver he'd taken from the leader's waistband during the brief contact. The biker's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't even felt the weapon being removed. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. 4 bikers lay groaning on the floor, and their leader stood frozen, his arm trapped in James's grip. The veteran's breathing hadn't even quickened. Pete Steiner was dead silent except for the sound of approaching police sirens. Someone had managed to call 911 during the chaos. James kept his hold on the leader, his eyes scanning the room to ensure everyone was safe. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Pete had moved beside her protectively, while old Mr. Peterson stared at the scene with his mouth open. None of them could believe what they had just witnessed. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows of Pete's diner as 2 police cars pulled up outside. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the now quiet restaurant. James still held the biker leader's arm firmly, while the other 4 troublemakers remained scattered across the floor, groaning in pain. Officer Mike Thompson, a regular at the diner who usually came in for morning coffee, burst through the door with his partner, both with hands on their holsters. They quickly took in the scene: the overturned chairs, broken dishes on the floor, and James standing calmly in the middle of it all. "James?" Officer Thompson said, surprised to see the quiet veteran he knew from his morning shifts. "What happened here?" His eyes fell on the revolver James had carefully placed on a nearby table, well out of everyone's reach. "These gentlemen were causing trouble," James replied simply, his voice steady. "They were harassing Sarah and threatened Pete. The leader had an illegal concealed weapon." He nodded toward the gun on the table. The bikers started shouting all at once, trying to tell their version of the story. "He attacked us," the leader yelled, still unable to break free from James's expert hold. "We were just having dinner." Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "That's not true," she said, showing her bruised wrist to the officers. "They were harassing me, and when Mr. Pete tried to help, they threatened to hurt him. Mr. Mitchell only stepped in to protect us." Old Mr. Peterson hobbled forward, leaning on his cane. "I saw everything, officers. That big fellow there," he pointed to the leader, "had a hold of Sarah's wrist and wouldn't let go. These thugs were threatening everyone in the diner. The veteran only acted to protect us all." Other customers who had witnessed the event began speaking up, one after another. They described how James had given the bikers every chance to leave peacefully, how he had only acted in defense, and how he had handled the situation with remarkable restraint. Pete added his account, explaining how the bikers had entered looking for trouble and how James had prevented what could have been a much worse situation. "He saved my diner, officers," Pete said firmly, "and probably saved some of us from getting hurt." Officer Thompson's partner began collecting the fallen weapons while other officers who had arrived started handcuffing the bikers. The leader continued to protest as he was led away, but his threats had lost their power. His tough guy image had been shattered by a quiet veteran who hadn't even broken a sweat. James finally released the leader into police custody and stepped back, his posture relaxing slightly. Officer Thompson pulled out his notepad and began taking James's official statement. "You'll need to come down to the station tomorrow to file a formal report," he said. "But from what I'm seeing and hearing, this was clearly self-defense." Sarah, still shaking slightly from the experience, brought James a fresh cup of coffee. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, tears in her eyes. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." James accepted the coffee with a gentle nod. "You're welcome, Sarah," he replied quietly. He looked around at the mess: broken dishes, overturned furniture, and scattered food. Without a word, he began helping Pete and Sarah clean up. Other customers joined in the cleanup effort, carefully picking up broken plates and righting overturned chairs. The sense of community in Pete's diner had grown stronger through the shared experience. People who had been strangers an hour ago worked together, talking about what they had witnessed. As the police finished taking statements and the last of the bikers was led away, Officer Thompson approached James one last time. "You know," he said with a slight smile, "when I first met you during my morning coffee runs, I never would have guessed you could handle 5 guys like that." James gave a small shrug as he wiped down a table. "Marines are trained to handle difficult situations," he said simply. "Sometimes the best fighting is the kind that ends quickly." The evening was growing late, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Pete announced that coffee was on the house, and the diner slowly returned to its usual peaceful atmosphere. The only difference was the way people now looked at the quiet veteran in the corner booth, with newfound respect and gratitude. The next morning, Pete's diner was busier than usual. Word had spread quickly through the small town about what had happened the previous evening. People came in hoping to hear the story firsthand from those who had witnessed it. Sarah found herself telling the tale over and over as she served coffee and breakfast. "I heard he took down all 5 of them with one punch," a young man at the counter said excitedly to his friend. Old Mr. Peterson, sitting in his usual spot, shook his head. No, that's not how it happened at all," the elderly man corrected him. "What we saw was something special. That veteran moved like water. No wasted motion, no showing off. It was beautiful, really. Nothing like those action movies." Pete had put up a new "No Weapons Allowed" sign on the front door, and underneath it was a smaller sign that read "Protected by Combat Veterans." He smiled every time he looked at it, remembering how James had saved his diner and possibly several lives. Around noon, a news van pulled up outside the diner. A reporter with perfectly styled hair and a bright smile walked in, camera crew following close behind. "We're here to interview the hero veteran who single-handedly stopped a biker gang," she announced cheerfully. Sarah approached them with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Mitchell isn't here right now. He only comes in on Thursday evenings." The reporter looked disappointed but decided to interview Pete and the other regulars instead. Pete told the camera about James's quiet strength and how he had given the bikers every chance to leave peacefully. Sarah showed her wrist, where the bruises were now a dark purple, and described how James had stepped in to protect her. The police found out that these weren't just ordinary troublemakers, Pete explained to the reporter. That gang had been causing problems all across 3 counties. They had weapons, drugs, and warrants out for their arrest. Who knows what might have happened if James hadn't been here? The story made the evening news, complete with security camera footage from the diner showing James's impressive display of combat skills. The reporter called it "Real-Life Hero. Veteran Protects Local Diner," and the story quickly went viral on social media. By late afternoon, Pete had received calls from several Marine veteran groups praising James's actions. Some offered to help with any legal expenses, while others wanted to give him awards for protecting the community. Pete took down their numbers but knew James wouldn't want all this attention. Officer Thompson stopped by during his patrol to give an update. "Those guys are facing serious charges," he told Pete while sipping his coffee. "The leader had an unregistered weapon, and we found other illegal items on them. They won't be bothering anyone for a long time." Sarah spent the day receiving tips from grateful customers who had heard the story. Many left notes saying they felt safer knowing people like James were around. She collected all the notes in a small box, planning to give them to James when he came in next. Pete's phone rang again, this time from a martial arts school in the next town. They wanted to offer James a job as an instructor. "I'll pass along the message," Pete said, adding it to the growing list of calls he received. Old Mr. Peterson stayed at the diner longer than usual, proudly showing younger customers exactly where he had been sitting during the incident. "You should have seen how calm he was," he told everyone who would listen. "Reminded me of my days in Korea, seeing a real professional in action." As evening approached, Pete noticed more customers than usual staying late. Several admitted they were hoping to catch a glimpse of James, even though they knew it wasn't his regular day to visit. Thursday, Pete kept telling them with a smile, he only comes in on Thursdays. But secretly, he wondered if James would come back at all, given all the attention his actions had attracted. Sarah finished her shift and looked at the box of thank you notes she had collected. "He'll come back," she said confidently to Pete. "He's not the type to let anything change his routine. Not even this." The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the diner's windows. The events of the previous night had changed something in the small town's atmosphere. People felt safer, prouder of their community, and more connected to each other. all thanks to a quiet veteran who had simply done what he thought was right. Thursday evening arrived, and Pete's Diner was packed like never before. Every booth was full, and people stood waiting against the walls. The clock showed 6:25 p.m., and all eyes kept darting to the door. Everyone wondered if James Mitchell would still come for his regular dinner after all the attention his story had received. Sarah nervously adjusted the silverware at James's usual corner booth, which Pete had reserved with a small reserved sign despite the crowd. She had placed the box of thank you notes safely behind the counter, not wanting to overwhelm him if he showed up. "Maybe he won't come," someone whispered. All this attention might have scared him away. Old Mr. Peterson shook his head from his spot at the counter. "You folks don't understand men like James. 20 years in the Marines means he values routine. He'll be here." At exactly 6:30 p.m., the bell above the door chimed. The entire diner fell silent as James Mitchell walked in, wearing his usual simple jacket and carrying himself with the same quiet dignity as always. He paused for a moment, surprised by the crowd, but his face remained calm. Several people started to applaud, but Pate quickly waved them quiet. He knew James wouldn't want that kind of attention. The veteran made his way to his corner booth, nodding politely to those he passed. People tried to catch his eye, hoping to shake his hand or pat him on the back, but something in his manner kept them from approaching. Sarah hurried over with his coffee, her hands shaking slightly. "Your usual, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, trying to keep things normal. James gave her a gentle smile and nodded, noticing that her bruises were healing well. Pete came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. "James," he said quietly, "there's something you should know. The police chief called earlier. Those bikers you stopped? Turns out they were wanted in 3 states. They found stolen goods in their bikes and evidence connecting them to several robberies." James took a sip of his coffee, showing no reaction to the news. But Pete continued, "The FBI is involved now. They've been tracking this gang for months. You didn't just save my diner, James. You helped catch some real criminals." The veteran set down his coffee cup carefully. "They made a choice to cause trouble," he said simply. "They faced the consequences." Gradually, the other customers returned to their own conversations, though many still glanced at James's corner. Young children pointed at him in awe, while their parents tried to quiet them. A few veterans who had come specially to meet him offered respectful salutes from across the room, which James returned with a small nod. Sarah brought his meatloaf, the portion slightly larger than usual. She placed the box of thank you notes beside his plate. "People have been leaving these for you all week," she explained softly. "You don't have to read them now. You can take them home if you'd like." James looked at the box for a moment, then carefully moved it aside to make room for his meal. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly. "How's your wrist?" "Much better," she smiled, touching the fading bruises. "The doctor said there's no lasting damage. I never properly thanked you for what you did." James shook his head slightly. "No thanks needed. It's what any Marine would have done." As he ate his dinner, Pete dealt with a constant stream of phone calls from reporters and TV stations wanting interviews. He turned them all down, protecting James's privacy. The veteran continued eating quietly, seemingly oblivious to the attention around him. Officer Thompson stopped by briefly, not in uniform but carrying a folder. "The chief wanted you to have this," he said, placing it near James. "It's a letter of commendation from the department. The mayor wants to give you a civilian service award, too." James looked up from his meal. "That's not necessary," he said firmly. "I'm not looking for recognition." The officer nodded understanding. "I know. That's exactly why you deserve it." The evening continued, and slowly the crowd began to thin. Those who had come hoping for excitement or drama left disappointed, having witnessed nothing more than a quiet veteran enjoying his regular Thursday dinner. But they had seen something important. A true hero, one who acted not for glory or recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. 3 months had passed since the incident at Pete's Diner. The excitement had died down, and life in the small town had mostly returned to normal. The viral videos had faded from social media, and the news vans had long since departed. But things at Pete's Diner were forever changed in subtle ways. James still came every Thursday at exactly 6:30 p.m., as regular as clockwork. The corner booth remained his spot, though Pete had made one small change. A small brass plaque now marked the booth, reading simply, Reserved, USMC. James had raised an eyebrow when he first saw it, but hadn't asked for it to be removed. The Road Raiders motorcycle gang had faced justice. The leader received 5 years in prison for illegal weapons possession and assault. His followers got shorter sentences, but all of them were banned from coming within 500 feet of Pete's diner. Officer Thompson made sure to tell James this news, though the veteran had simply nodded and continued eating his meatloaf. Sarah's confidence had grown significantly. She no longer jumped at the sound of motorcycles passing by, and she carried herself with a new sense of security. She had taken self-defense classes at the local community center, inspired by how James had handled the situation without excessive violence. "You know," she told James one Thursday evening while serving his coffee, "I read all about Marine Corps training after what happened, about how you're taught to end conflicts quickly and safely. It helped me understand why you moved the way you did that night." James gave her one of his rare smiles. "The best fight is the one you don't have to fight," he said. "But it's good to be prepared." Sarah beamed at getting more than his usual quiet nod. Pete had made some changes to the diner too. He installed better security cameras and proper lighting in the parking lot. But more importantly, his diner had become a sort of unofficial gathering place for local veterans. Every now and then, a former soldier or Marine would stop by, having heard the story, and sit quietly near James's booth. The box of thank you notes had finally made it to James's home. He never mentioned if he read them, but Pete noticed that the veteran's wallet now contained one small note, carefully folded. It was from Tommy, the Thompsons' 8-year-old son, who had written, "Thank you for being a real hero. You're better than Superman because you're real." Old Mr. Peterson still told the story to anyone who would listen, though his version got more elaborate each time. "Did I tell you about how he disarmed 5 men while blindfolded?" He'd begin, until Pete gently corrected him. The diner's business had improved steadily. People felt safe there, knowing it was protected. Pete had started a wall of honor near the entrance, displaying photos of local service members. James's photo wasn't among them, yet politely declined to be included. But his presence was felt all the same. One particular Thursday evening, as James finished his meal, Pete brought him a fresh slice of apple pie. "On the house," the old owner said, sitting down across from him. "You know, James, what you did that night. It wasn't just about stopping those bikers. You showed people that one person standing up for what's right can make a difference." James carefully cut into his pie. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he replied quietly. "One person willing to act." As the sun set outside Pete's diner, casting long shadows through the windows, the regular customers went about their evening routines. Sarah served coffee, Pete worked in the kitchen, and old Mr. Peterson did his crossword puzzle. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But now everyone understood that real heroes didn't wear capes or seek attention. Sometimes they were quiet veterans in corner booths, enjoying their Thursday meatloaf, ready to stand up when needed. James Mitchell had taught them all that courage wasn't about looking for trouble. It was about being willing to stop it when it found you. The bell above the door chimed softly as new customers entered, and life at Pete's Diner continued. The story of the veteran and the bikers would be told for years to come, but for James, it was just another Thursday evening in his corner booth, exactly as he liked it.